I spoke with President Xi. We had a good talk.
When it comes to the nitty-gritty, really, of how US user data will be served and how the algorithm will be maintained, it's quite murky at this stage, and there's not been a lot of details released.
And I very much appreciate that he approved the deal.
I wouldn't underestimate the possibility that Beijing holds out, knowing just how much political value Trump has attached to this deal at this stage.
TikTok has been in American political crosshairs for years. Now Donald Trump says he's lined up a deal for the Chinese company's U.S. operations to be handed over to U.S. control. But how far along is an agreement? What did China and Trump get from it? And what does it mean for TikTok users? Juliana Bouchard is a senior analyst with Rhodium Group's China Corporate Advisory Practice, and she joins me now for more. Juliana, thanks for coming along. A deal was supposed to put an end to concerns about Chinese influence over TikTok in the U.S. by putting control of the app into American hands. We'll get into the details in just a moment, but I want to ask quickly, what's your assessment? Would this deal, as proposed by Trump, do just that?
It's a bit unclear at this stage, to be honest. There have been some details of the deals that have been released. There was an executive order that was published last week, that said that the TikTok app would be transferred to a newly established joint venture in the US, which would be majority owned by US investors, and ByteDance would retain less than 20% of that new joint venture. But when it comes to the nitty-gritty, really, of how US user data will be served and how the algorithm will be maintained, it's quite murky at this stage, and there's not been a lot of details released. So it's unclear at this stage, unfortunately.
All right, for our viewers, let's explain that background a little bit more clearly. Trump did sign that executive order outlining a deal in which TikTok owner ByteDance, that's a Chinese company, would reduce its stake to less than 20%. It would create a joint venture with a group of investors who were not named in the order, who would essentially own the rest. Now, according to Trump, that joint venture would then ensure that China would not have control of the app because the joint venture would essentially call the shots. The deal is supposed to be finalized by late January. So who is the investor group? Well, the White House later confirmed that software firm Oracle would manage the app. Other investors could include Lachlan Murdoch and his father Rupert, owner of News Corp, tech CEO Michael Dell, and an Abu Dhabi investment firm MGX. So a wide swath of investors there, and those are just three of the bigger ones. Juliana, first of all, before we get into further details, has Beijing even said whether it approves this deal as outlined by Trump? Do we know where they stand?
So we know that President Trump and Xi have spoken about the agreement, and Xi has reportedly given his tacit approval that he would, sign off on this deal and allow for the transfer of the algorithm to this new US-based entity. But I would point out that at this stage, this is, just something that President Trump himself has reported, and that Beijing's approval remains really high level. And given the ongoing friction points in the relationship, I wouldn't underestimate the possibility that Beijing holds out, knowing just how much political value Trump has attached to this deal at this stage.
The original goal of a deal, as laid out by Congress in legislation that it passed and that President Biden signed earlier this year, was to end what it called an operational relationship between the former owners of TikTok, ByteDance, and the new owners. Again, do we know if this deal essentially does that? You said there's still things that are unclear.
That's right. We don't know exactly how the new algorithm will be managed. So what we've known from the executive order that was published and from media reports at this stage, the Oracle will be able to license the source code from ByteDance, copy it, and retrain it on American data. But we don't know to what extent ByteDance will still be able to govern updates to the algorithm that depends on global data. Algorithms aren't static things. They require constant monitoring, constant fine-tuning, and updates based on data. And it's unclear, as I was saying, to what extent Oracle will be able to monitor and audit the updates that ByteDance does to the sort of global portion of the algorithm.
Does that mean that, in theory, even the U.S. Congress might be sort of wary of whether this deal then meets their requirements?
Absolutely. I think the first regulatory concern with this deal is going to stem from Congress itself. And we've seen parts of Congress already begin to mobilize. Representative John Molinar, who is a Republican and the chairman of the House Select Committee on China, he was quite instrumental in getting this bill over the finish line last year when it passed Congress. And he has already, raised the question over whether this new framework deal is actually compliant with the terms set out in the act. And he's laid out his intention to call the leadership of the new U.S. TikTok entity for a hearing before the end of the year to, ensure that fundamental concerns that Americans have over the governance of TikTok have been addressed by this framework agreement.
Meanwhile, the valuation of those U.S. operations of TikTok, given by the White House, in this case, I think it was by J.D. Vance, was put at $14 billion. And I believe we had seen earlier estimates of $300 billion for the entire TikTok, for TikTok as a whole. Why is it so low? Do we understand what's going on there?
That's right. That's quite a surprise. But to be honest, it's also not something that's been finished and set in stone yet. J.D. Vance has said, I believe, that this is something that investors still need to work out appropriately. So we could see a change in the final number. I think most interesting will be also how profit sharing is distributed amongst the partners that compose this new consortium. There are reports that ByteDance could actually earn up to 50% of the profit share from the new entity, despite only having a 20% equity stake. Another thing that's up in the air at this stage in terms of valuation is how much of a cut the White House or the U.S. government would be able to make from having sort of brokered this deal. President Trump has said that he, intends to seek compensation for the government's effort in brokering this deal. But at this stage, we don't know quite yet what this will look like.
This deal and this executive order announced as part of broader negotiations, which you referred to between China and the U.S., trade negotiations. Are we seeing that the TikTok deal has just become an aspect of trade negotiations and that perhaps something could change in the coming months?
I think a lot could still change in the coming months. I believe that at the minute we're seeing U.S.-China policy enter quite a transactional approach. This first happened when President Trump reversed the ban on the sale of NVIDIA H20 chips in China in exchange for a 15% cut on revenues. And now this framework deal for TikTok, which doesn't completely edge out the Chinese owner ByteDance from it, is another example of that transactional turn of Trump's China policy. And I believe we're going to see more of that in the coming months in the lead up to a possible Trump-Xi summit, as both sides are sort of testing the grounds for a possible grand bargain, any aspects of deal making. But I wouldn't also underestimate the underlying friction points in the relationship that could, lead to a change in course direction in the next couple of months. There are a number of policies that the Trump administration continues to press ahead with. Just yesterday, we saw an extension of a U.S. trade blacklist, the entity list being expanded to all Chinese subsidiaries that are on this list. This is something that Beijing is very upset with. In a couple of weeks, the U.S. will also impose fees on Chinese-built vessels. This is also something that's quite upsetting to Beijing. The U.S. still maintains export controls on high-end semiconductor manufacturing equipment, which is also another key concern for Beijing. These are all things that are at play and that Beijing could look to weaponize, potentially by withholding its approval of the TikTok deal in the coming months if it wants to pressure, the U.S. to desist on these policy moves. So I believe, absolutely, the TikTok deal is part of the overarching U.S.-China deal-making dynamics.
It's interesting when we look at the timeline of this whole saga with TikTok is that Trump actually kicked off this divestment process in his first term, signing an executive order calling TikTok a national security threat in 2020. But then he postponed the deadline for divestment The Biden administration came in, postponed its defense of Trump's ban while it looked at the issue. Then we saw in 2022 new reporting showing that China-based ByteDance employees had accessed U.S. user data, and then the FBI raised new national security concerns. Congress passed a law in 2024 requiring ByteDance to sell its stake or face a ban. President Biden, as I mentioned, signed that law. It was challenged by ByteDance. The Supreme Court, however, upheld the law in January 2025, just before Trump came into office. On January 18th, the app went dark in the U.S. It returned just hours later after President-elect Trump said that he would bring it back, and that's where we are since. There's a lot of other legal questions about how Trump has been able to keep this issue alive for so long. But I just want to ask, from your perspective and looking at the broader arc of negotiations with China and Trump's administration, why has Trump changed his tune on TikTok?
I don't believe he's completely changed his tune. He's still going ahead with, this new framework, which does remove some of the control that ByteDance had previously over TikTok. But it's also clear to him that at this stage, TikTok has only grown in popularity, and this is really becoming also a domestic support issue. President Trump doesn't want to be the president that makes TikTok, this beloved app, go dark in the US. And when he was first trying to ban TikTok under his first presidency, TikTok wasn't nearly as popular and as important as it is today for many influencers and small business owners. So I think it's also a question of to what extent the popularity of TikTok has grown in the meantime.
We know that Trump gets something big out of this proposed deal, handing assets over to Larry Ellison. He's the owner of Oracle, and then the Murdochs, all three of them close allies with President Trump. Can we say anything about what this means for media consolidation in the U.S.?
I don't have a viewpoint on that, to be honest.
Okay. Well, I just want to ask, is this the Abu Dhabi, another investment? Let me start over. Another part of this investment team that we've heard would come into this deal is an Abu Dhabi group, MGX, also to be involved in this consortium. What kind of impact, if any, does that really have on the investment group coming together?
Again, unfortunately, the details haven't been released, so we don't know just how exactly MGX will fit into this broader consortium. But I would read this as part of the UAE's grander strategy to curry favor with the Trump administration. And MGX has been playing a key role here. Not long ago, we saw MGX makes a pretty sizable investment into the use of Trump's stablecoin. So it is, I think I would read it as part of that effort in general for the UAE to show that it's a trusted partner and tech investor for the US. Although one element that I do find interesting is that a few months ago, and I think it's still an argument that many in the Trump administration would make, is that Middle Eastern investors, Middle Eastern tech companies have been playing on both sides, having partnerships with both Chinese companies as well as American companies. And this was a point of friction with the US government saying, no, you need to sort of divorce your linkages from Chinese tech companies. But now, one way, interestingly enough, to curry favor with the Trump administration is to end up in a deal where MGX is effectively investing into a Chinese company. I think that's a pretty interesting turn of events.
What about Europe and the rest of the world? Presumably countries that face similar security questions surrounding TikTok, also affecting EU data when we look at Europe. Will we see any similar action from the European side? Are European regulators watching this? What can we say?
Absolutely. I think, the EU and at the Commission level or at the member state level, all very much have the same concerns about TikTok as Americans had, whether TikTok transfers user data over to China or whether it's potentially accessible via backdoors, and whether the Chinese state is able to have any influence on content moderation via this control of the content recommendation algorithm. And I think this was very much shown during the Romanian election in May last year, I believe, when suddenly thousands of accounts were reactivated to lend support to a pro-Russian far-right candidate. And we've seen the commission sort of double down on the various legal tools that it has to hold TikTok accountable. They've initiated formal proceeding against TikTok for the role that it played in the Romanian election interference. Another potentially potent tool that the EU has as its hand is the Digital Services Act, where very large online platforms like TikTok need to, assess and mitigate the risks of negative consequences on users' mental well-being, but also civic discourse and electoral processes. And the EU, has already launched investigations into TikTok's compliance with the DSA. So this is something that's constantly evolving, and we could see more action from the EU under that banner. But I will say that the EU doesn't tend to generally go as far with regards to its China policy as the US does. So something as blunt as forcing a divestment in the way that the Congress Act did last year is rather unlikely in the European Union.
Juliana, what does this saga tell us about this app, TikTok, about social media, and just about how popularity amongst user groups around the world can really affect politics? We talked about Trump, his feelings about TikTok, how they've changed somewhat. Maybe they haven't changed dramatically, but basically this is an app that's only become more popular, and it seems like that's made it more politically difficult to do something about it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as we were saying just before, right, in 2020, this is when Trump initially tried to force a divestment of the app, but obviously always came up over hurdles over whether or not it would be able to maintain the integrity of the algorithm and what makes it as successful as an app. And ultimately, ByteDance control over the secret sauce, the algorithm that makes TikTok so effective and so addictive in some regards has been, a huge lever that Beijing has been able to, use in its negotiations with the US. So it's very interesting to see how popularity among especially younger audiences have made their way into, US-China grand bargain.
All right, that's Juliana Bouchot, a senior analyst with Rhodium Group's China Corporate Advisory Practice. Juliana, thanks so much.
Thank you for having me.